Video cameras have completely changed. They're becoming better and cheaper faster than ever before. And a lot of popular cameras aren't worth the money anymore. If you're not careful, you might overpay and get the wrong camera. So I'm breaking down the best video cameras based on different shooting styles, so regardless of what kind of camera you need, you'll find it here. Also, I'll leave links down below for the best pricing on all of the cameras. Now, the first camera on this list is probably the camera that's going to be the perfect fit for most people. And most people need something that's a jack of all trades and simple to work with. Because for someone who's doing this as a hobby, for social media, freelance videography work, or an aspiring cinematographer, your shooting often changes day by day and by shoot, and you need something that can kind of do it all without compromise. Unfortunately, most cameras are good at a few things and compromise on the rest. But there is one camera that can kind of do it all and is really easy to work with. And that is the Canon R6 Mark II. The best part about this camera is the fact that it has a 24 megapixel full frame sensor with incredible low light. As long as you use full stops of ISO at 800, 1600, 3200, all the way up to 12,800, you're going to get very clean results. So believe it or not, this is actually a pretty decent low light camera. And you can pretty much shoot in any environment with this camera. And the R6 Mark II also has a minimal rolling shutter, so it's a great camera for action and fast movement. And you can also shoot 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second without any sort of compromise or cropping into your sensor, which most cameras make you do. And on top of that, this camera also has a 6-hour record limit. However, that's only in 4K at 24 frames per second. Anything higher than that and you'll probably get overheating issues. But the best part is that the R6 Mark II also downsamples its footage from the entire 6K image area, so your 4K video will actually have the quality and detail of 6K, but in a smaller and easier to edit file size. And it can also do full HD resolution at 120 and 180 frames per second. When shooting in standard color, you only get 8-bit color, which isn't great for color grading, but it's a really good option for someone that needs to shoot stuff, edit it, and get it out the door. But you also have C-Log 3 on top of that does have 10-bit color, which will give you added dynamic range and more flexibility with your colors. And even though most people say they don't like C-Log 3, it's not that bad, and you'll get really good results if you know how to color grade. And the video codec or video file type in the R6 Mark II is also very easy to edit. So even if you have an old laptop or computer that's literally dying, you can still edit this footage no matter what. And even if you put it into your phone, you can easily edit these 4K files because of that file type. But I will have more high-end pro cameras with a professional codec later in this video. Now, there's two things that stand out to me about the R6 Mark II. One is the autofocus. It's very accurate. It has face and eye tracking, along with AI-based subject detection for animal, people, and cars. And with this, you're basically going to get set it and forget it autofocus. You're really not going to have issues with moving subject matter. And the stabilization in the R6 Mark II also works really well, and most Canon lenses also have stabilization in the lens, so you're going to get very smooth handheld results. Now, I realize you're probably getting this camera for video, but the R6 Mark II is actually a stunning photo camera as well. It can do 12 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode and a ridiculous 40 frames per second electronic shutter mode, so if you ever do need to have photos, this camera totally has you covered. Now, the button and ergonomics on this camera are perfect, and this is something that Canon is really known for. They have probably the best design in the camera industry. On top of that, it also has a side articulating screen that's also touch enabled, so you get touch control over your entire camera along with touch autofocus. And the R6 Mark II also has one of the best viewfinders you will ever use if you want to do photos. And you can also connect your R6 Mark II directly to your phone for image transfer and wireless control. And Canon has also made a ton of improvements to their smartphone app, so it works really well now. And the R6 Mark II also has a really large battery that's going to give you at least an hour and a half of non-stop video and several hundred photos, and you can also charge this camera via USB-C. Now, the one sort of downside of the Canon R6 Mark II and basically any Canon camera is that you can only use Canon lenses for autofocus on the Canon bodies, meaning you can only buy Canon lenses and you're locked into their ecosystem. This used to be a problem, but Canon has a really large variety of lenses and they're also reasonably priced. So it's not that much of a problem, but I just don't like that they do it. However, my favorite lenses for these Canon cameras are the 28 to 70mm f2.8, The 50mm f1.8 and 16mm f1.8, these are fantastic lenses and probably the only lenses you need for this camera. Apart from that, there's really no downside to the Canon R6 Mark II, and this should be the perfect camera for 90% of people out there. Now, I do want to give you guys a budget option if you like the Canon R6 Mark II, and for that, we have the little brother, the Canon R8. It's actually exactly the same as the R6 Mark II in terms of video features, but in a smaller body and $1,000 less. So for video shooters on a budget, this might also be a great option. But with a smaller body, you do have some compromises. A smaller battery, you can't record video for as long without overheating, and there's no in-body stabilization. However, you do have digital stabilization that works pretty well, and the R8 is also slower when it comes to mechanical photos at only 6 frames per second, but you can still do 40 frames per second electronic shutter mode. For $1,000 off the Canon R6 Mark II, you're getting a really good deal. Now, if the Canon cameras are Swiss Army knives, what if you want something a little more specialized? People who want to focus on high-end cinematic content like music videos, commercial, narrative films, or just something where you want to make art. We have to look at a brand that actually makes Hollywood cameras, and a lot of their Hollywood features actually trickle down into their prosumer mirrorless cameras. And that brand is Sony and the amazing FX3, which just got some brand new updates that makes it even closer to a pro camera. It has a 12 megapixel full frame sensor, and this sensor is known for having some of the best dynamic range, but it's also incredible in low light with a dual native ISO of 640 and 12,800 in S-Log3. And it's actually the best low light camera in the world, meaning you can pretty much shoot anywhere in the world, whether it's the city at nighttime or on the side of a mountain. And the FX3 autofocus does an incredible job. It's very accurate and very fast, but it's not Sony's newest autofocusing system, so it doesn't have AI tracking modes in it. However, it does have face and eye tracking, and the same goes for in-body stabilization, which is super solid and just about as good as the R6 Mark II. But then why would you get the FX3 over the R6 Mark II? Well, the main reason you would get the FX3 in general is that it does have the ability to shoot 4K at 24, 30, 60, all the way up to 120 frames per second without any sort of quality compromise or downgrade, meaning you never have to crop into your sensor. And it also does full HD at 120 and 240 frames per second. But as part of the new update, the FX3 can now shoot true 24p, so it's not 23.937, it's true 24p for theaters, and it can also do 4K DCI, which is slightly wider on the sides, and it also now has shutter angle, which is more so what Hollywood cinema cameras use. On top of that, it also has internal D-squeeze for 1.3 and 2.0 anamorphic lenses with 1.5 times D-squeeze coming in September 2025, which is kind of far away, but Sony's going to continuously update their cameras all the way up to another 18 months because they've actually released a game plan for this on their websites, but you're going to constantly get more and more of those high-end Hollywood features in the lower-end prosumer lineup. On top of that, it also has S-Log3 and HLG for professional color grading workflows, and it also has a professional codec that is anywhere between 200 to 600 megabits per second, and this is what you're going to be using if you're going to want to shoot for TV, high-end music videos, and commercials. And of course, the color is 10-bit 422, but you can also record ProRes 12-bit RAW video using external recorder like the Atomos Ninja or Atomos Shogun. And if you've ever heard of the FX3 being used on Hollywood movies like The Creator, they actually shot that movie using ProRes RAW because it's going to give you a lot more dynamic range and flexibility. Although external RAW recording isn't ideal, however, if you want internal RAW, there is something later in this video that's actually cheaper than the FX3 and does RAW internally. But the FX3 is more than just specs because it's also the body and design that's made for professional work. It has a built-in fan that gives you unlimited recording in any frame rate. You will never have any overheating issues with this camera. And the FX3 also comes with an audio top handle as part of the standard package that lets you plug in XLR mics for the best possible audio, making it an amazing documentary camera or anything where you need top-notch audio. Now, the FX3 isn't cheap, but it's worth every penny. However, if you want cheaper options, the best one is the Sony ZV-E1. It's the exact same sensor, frame rates, and video quality, but with better autofocus and better stabilization. However, you no longer have raw output and it doesn't come with an XLR handle or a built-in fan. However, it is $2,000 cheaper, making it half the price of the FX3. The ZV-E1 has more of a vlog camera design, and it's probably made for the same type of person that would like an R6 Mark II. Now, some people will tell you this camera has overheating issues. I've been using this camera forever. It really does not. Most of that has been fixed by firmware updates, and on top of that, you're only going to have overheating issues if you record 4K 60 or 4K 120 for more than 30 minutes, but at 4K at 24 frames per second, you can record for an hour and a half without any issues, but you can always just get a fan accessory, and this fixes all the overheating issues. However, if you definitely want a more professional style body, another really great option is the Sony FX-30. It's the exact same camera as the FX3 with the same autofocus, raw output, fan, unlimited recording, all that good stuff, but it doC have a smaller APS-C size sensor and only does 4K up to 60 frames per second. However, just like the R6 Mark II, it's also downsampled from 6K, giving your 4K video the quality of 6K. And it also has 4K at 120 frames per second, but it does have a pretty significant 1.6 times crop on an already smaller APS-C size sensor, so the 4K 120 isn't really ideal, but the FX30 is basically a baby FX3. Now, when it comes to the absolute best camera that's going to give you the best value for your money and also the best image, the answer is really easy. It's the Alexa LF for $65. I'm kidding. The actual brand is probably not a camera and brand that you've thought about because they don't really have the reputation. But like I said earlier, things in the video camera space are changing faster than ever before, and that brand and camera is actually the Nikon Z8. Because the Nikon Z8 is actually the same price as the FX3, but gives you almost double the power. It has a 45 megapixel sensor, and it can shoot 8K video at 23, 30, and 60 frames per second, and also 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second, all the way up to 120 frames per second without a crop or any sort of compromise. And it can shoot all of this in 12-bit RAW. But if you're thinking, bruh, raw video is way too much, the files are large, and I need a beefy computer, you can also shoot in H.265 up to 8K at 30 frames per second and 4K up to 120 frames per second. But if you want something in the middle of having the flexibility of RAW but the ease of editing as H.265, you can also shoot in ProRes, which is super easy to edit on even with the oldest computers, but it does have pretty big file sizes. And in this format, you can shoot 4K up to 30 frames per second or Full HD up to 120 frames per second, and this is perfect for those smaller projects. But you also have ProRes RAW, which is 5K up to 30 frames per second and 4K up to 60 frames per second, and again, you're not cropping on your sensor. And you can shoot all of this in N-Log for color grading. And because Nikon recently bought Red Cinema Cameras, which is a bona fide Hollywood cinema camera company, you now have the same color profiles in conversion LUTs as a Red Cinema camera, but you now also have updated colors in the Nikon cameras, which give you proper cinematic colors, which I think look beautiful, and I actually think these colors look better than any Canon camera out there. However, one issue that I do have with the Nikon Z8 is the autofocus. When you compare it to something like the newest Sony autofocus, it's not the best, and maybe not even quite as good as the R6 Mark II. But it does have AI subject detect for animal, birds, cars, planes, and insects, and for most low-end corporate stuff, maybe a bit of real estate, talking head, where you're just moving back and forth, it should be just fine. However, I don't think video autofocus really matters in a camera like this, because if you're going to be shooting ProRes and 12-bit RAW, you're probably going to be using cinema lenses, and in that case, autofocus doesn't matter. But for lower end jobs, this autofocus should do just fine if you set it up properly. And Nikon has also been releasing some new updates to the Z8 that makes improvements on the autofocus. Now, the body of the Nikon Z8 is pretty much like any other mirrorless camera. You've got the touch controls, you've got the same ergonomics. The one thing that I would have liked to see is a side flippy screen on the Nikon Z8, but instead it's just a tilt screen. But the screen on the back and the viewfinder are really high quality, and I haven't had any overheating issues with this camera whatsoever, and I've shot in the middle of the hot Canadian summer. Believe it or not, it gets pretty hot up here. I've had some hot card warnings, but I've never actually had the camera overheat and shut down. Now, if you want a cheaper option, the camera you should look at is the Z6 III. It's actually the same price as the R6 Mark II, but with way better specs, and it's very similar to the Nikon Z8 in terms of raw output and codecs. It has a lower 24 megapixel sensor that gives you 6K up to 60 frames per second and 12-bit RAW and varying frame rates in H.265, ProRes, and ProRes RAW. I don't particularly love the H.265. It has a lot of denoising on it, so it's not the sharpest image, but it's good enough for most projects. Like I'm using it here. It doesn't look that bad. But if you do pick up the Nikon Z6 III, I would probably pick it up for the RAW and the ProRes. And the autofocus in the Z6 III is massively improved over the Z8. I actually shot an entire 3-day long YouTube video just using the Z6 III, and I had just two autofocusing issues. But right now, Nikon cameras are the best bang for your buck. And whether you're picking up the Nikon, Sony, or Canon, I'll leave links down below for the best pricing on all of these cameras, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.